Okay. Um, we're looking at politics again. We're looking at critical race theory for now. And I said initially that I was thinking of talking about tearing down statues and American exceptionalism, things like that. But I decided instead, first I need to talk about a more important theoretical thing that's going on with critical race theory. And it's something called the hermeneutic of suspicion. So we're going to get into some philosophy here just so you understand some background and then try to see how to biblically evaluate what's going on with this. So there's a couple things in philosophy that are similar. One is called the hermeneutic of skepticism, and one is called the hermeneutic of suspicion. And you can especially see how these function when people are arguing against the existence of God. When philosophers are arguing for or against whether God exists, the hermeneutic of skepticism argues against Christianity this way. Somebody says, "Give me your proof for God." And I maybe give them a proof. I say, here it is. And then they argue back vigorously. That's the hermeneutic of skepticism. That's the idea of being skeptical of God or of whatever else. This could be about things besides God as well. But it's most clear when you think about the way people argue against the existence of God. Okay. But here's what the hermeneutic of suspicion does. Somebody says, here are my arguments for God. And the person on the other side doesn't argue back against those arguments. What they say is, but what are your motives for believing that? Wow, you've got some real issues. So they don't even engage with the argument. They just suspect your motives. This is called the hermeneutic of suspicion, and it's been around for about a century and a half now in philosophy, and it's very much a part of critical theory and critical race theory. So the idea here, the word hermeneutic, is a method of interpretation. So biblical hermeneutics is the system we use to interpret scripture. The hermeneutic of suspicion is a system that people use to interpret other people's statements. If you're a critical race theorist, you interpret people in what they say and what they're doing in a certain way based on your suspicion that they're motivated by racism. And the suspicion here means that you've got a lens of suspicion, a filter of suspicion about the speaker's motives and authenticity. You're not really being honest. You're not really speaking for the reasons you say you are. And this is something that you run into a lot when you engage with people about critical race theory and about many other things in the culture today. People are instantly suspicious that whatever you're saying isn't really being said for the reasons that you say it is. All right. So there were two early pioneers of the hermeneutic of suspicion in philosophy. One was Freud and one was Marx. Freud was the father of a certain branch of psychology rather than a philosopher, but a lot of what he did was very philosophical in nature. So let's talk about Freud and Marx a little bit just to show you what's going on here. I'm going to start with Freud. If Freud was talking to somebody who had, say, like a paranoid disorder, so and that person said, everyone's out to get me, Freud would have said, the thing you don't do with somebody like that is to argue with them. Because it doesn't matter what you do to prove them wrong, they will always come up with a way to justify their belief, because they need to believe it because of their disorder. He says, what you do is you don't argue with him. Instead, you just diagnose him and then cure him. And then he won't need to believe that anymore. Well, that makes sense if you're dealing with a true neurosis or psychosis. But for Freud, that's what Christianity was. If a Christian says, I believe in God, Freud would have said, don't argue with him, just diagnose and cure him. Explain to him the reasons why he believes in God are just because he wants to believe in a father figure in the sky or something. And then once he realizes his neurosis, maybe it won't hold on to him and he won't need to believe anymore. That's how Freud approached arguments for God. He basically ignored the argument and attacked the motives and the authenticity of the person talking to him. Marx did kind of the same thing. If somebody said, I believe in God, he would have said, don't argue with him, show him the class struggle, show him that he's being influenced by the propaganda of the world around him, that kind of a thing. So both of them are a little frustrated, would have been frustrating to argue with because they wouldn't have been willing to argue. They wouldn't have even listened to what you were saying. They would have just tried to sort of route around that and just tell you how your motives or your heart or your reasons were wrong. There's a couple of other uses of the hermeneutic of suspicion here. One is actually Christian apologetics. Christians use this a lot. I'm not sure we usually should, but I think there's some times when we can. For example, you'll hear people say, somebody will say, here's why I don't believe in God. And the Christian will say, well, you only think that because you don't want God to judge you. Notice they haven't given an answer to the argument. They've just said your real reason for not believing in God is because you have a sinful heart and you don't want to be in judgment. Now, the tricky thing is, this isn't a very helpful way to argue, but it is somewhat biblical. Here's an example from Romans 1. It says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they're without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations. They didn't want to believe in God, so they tried to speculate other ways we could be around, and their foolish heart was darkened. So Romans 1 is kind of using the hermeneutic of suspicion when it thinks about atheism. It's saying if somebody doesn't believe in God, or also about false gods, it doesn't believe in the right kind of God, it's not that God didn't show it to them. They somehow deep down know, but they've hidden that from themselves because they don't want to have the real God around. So we use this sometimes, this hermeneutic of suspicion. Another place that is really used, of course, is in critical race theory, because the critical theory in general and critical race theory is really important to the critical race theorist to say that the racial oppression that's around is sort of inevitable and always happens. And so if you say to somebody who's a critical race theorist, look, we've done these things, in the civil rights movement and in other places, we've done all these things to eliminate racism, they will think to themselves, wait, why would you say that? What's in it for you? How does this really help perpetuate racism? And they will look for things in what you've done that will somehow actually still keep one race in charge of the other. And there's sort of this assumption that anything a white person or a system of white people or a group of white people do, which seems like it's in favor of black people, is secretly just really reasserting their dominance. And that suspicion is hard to deal with if you're trying to talk with somebody and they won't see anything that you say as legitimately coming from good motives. So this is used in, again, we use it sometimes as Christians when we talk about atheists, and they have the same frustration. Why won't you just listen to me when I tell you there's reasons I don't believe in God? And we get frustrated when we talk with people in critical theory. So we need to think a little bit about this hermeneutic of suspicion. When is it good? When is it bad? How does it line up biblically? So first of all, there are several problems with the hermeneutic of suspicion. First of all, it's just bad logic. If I give you an argument for something and you respond not by answering the argument, but by just attacking me, there's names for that. It's called the ad hominem fallacy. It's called the genetic fallacy, two different fallacies. Basically, in other words, people have identified that that's not really logically accurate. It doesn't really answer the question. But again, this works on both grounds. If you're talking to an atheist and they say, well, here's why I don't believe, and you ignore their argument and just say, well, you're just sinful and don't want to accept God, you can say that, but it's not a very logical way to respond to their argument. If you want to respond logically and sort of defend the faith on a logical basis, you'll have to actually address the arguments they're making. So it is bad logic, and that's one thing you can do is just dismiss it as bad logic. Also, it always cuts both ways. And when Freud says to the Christian, you just believe in God because of your neurosis, it's always possible to respond to Freud and say, you just don't believe in God because you don't want there to be a God. Whenever somebody uses the hermeneutic of suspicion, they're always open to being attacked in the same themselves in the same way. Somebody says, you're just doing this because of your racism, and it's always easy to say, well, you're only seeing it as racist because it's your cause in life and you need to see it there or something. There's always a way that it cuts both ways. That makes it tricky to use because you can only sort of get away with it as long as you don't notice that it could be true of you yourself, as long as you're only sort of being blind to that. Also, it just does show disrespect to people we're dialoguing with. If I'm trying to give you reasons for what I believe or reasons for what I don't believe, I really need you to listen to me and respond to me, not to just start psychoanalyzing me or trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I really need you to listen. And this, again, happens on all sides. These are the problems with the hermeneutic of suspicion. However, it's been really popular in the last 100 years, partly because it's been really effective. There are times when the hermeneutic of suspicion has led to insights which are actually true, which are actually there, and sometimes it can give us great insight. So, can the hermeneutic of suspicion be helpful? Yes, in certain kinds of circumstances. And this is helpful for us to know. First of all, it reminds us that our hearts can be deceptive. It is true that a person can fail to believe in God because he doesn't want to face judgment. It is true that a Christian can do certain things and say certain things and think they're doing it for religious reasons, and in fact they're doing it from selfishness or from self-deception or from self-righteousness. It is true that we can think we're not being racist and actually we still are sort of being racist. There's a lot of ways in which our hearts are deceptive, and that's very biblical. Remember Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? By desperately sick there, it means specifically in that it's so deceitful. Now, I think as Christians, our hearts have been changed, but this is still true of us in the flesh. It's just not true of our deepest, most essential nature. But still, we should see the deceitfulness of our heart as something that's definitely possible for us to have problems with. Here's a passage from Psalm 19. Who can discern his errors? Acquit me of hidden faults. He's saying, God, don't just take away the faults I see. Take away the faults I don't see. And keep back your servant from presumptuous sins. That's the same thing. He means the sins that I thought that are there, that I don't even know that I have, that I'm just presuming something. Let them not rule over me. We can be ruled by sins we don't even realize we have, by errors, by hidden faults, by presumptuous sins. And he says, God, if you will remove those from me, then I will be blameless, and I'll be acquitted of great transgression. We have such great transgression in our lives that we don't even see. I remember one of the most important moments of my life, not moments, times of in my life, was about 30 years ago when I went through a fairly serious depression. And it was about 10 years long. But at the end of that time, I realized that God had shown me something that I had never realized before. He had taken some of the things that I thought were most admirable in my Christian life, the things I was proudest of spiritually, and he showed me that those things had a lot of selfishness to them. And I'd never seen that before. And sometimes I think we are ruled by sins we're not aware of, and that's why they rule us. We don't even know they're there. So the hermeneutic of suspicion applied to ourselves is sometimes very helpful. Sometimes when I read a scripture, I need to say, I seem to be okay here, but maybe I should be suspicious of my motives. Maybe I'm not really doing this for the reason I say I am. And when our enemies accuse us of something, it is still always worth it for us to take that back to God and say, is there some deceptive sin that's ruling over me that I need to be aware of? So that's the first place it can be helpful. Second place, it protects us as we interact with toxic people. What I mean is, most people are reasonable and rational and you can get along with them pretty well, even if you disagree greatly with them about their politics or about the actions they want to take, even if you think they're making some horrible mistakes. But there are some people who are just simply gaslighting everybody, or they're narcissistic. There's all sorts of different pop psychology words for it. But they are deliberately deceptive in everything they say, and they only think about how to say things in order to manipulate. And if you try to reason with somebody who's in that situation, if you become aware that somebody really is a toxic gaslighter, and you try to reason with them and engage with them, they will simply use everything you say against you and never be treating you fairly or responding to you fairly. And with those people, a hermeneutic of suspicion is really the only healthy way to interact with them, to be always suspicious. Why are they saying this? What are they trying to get out of it? And let me give you an example of this from Scripture. 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. Paul, in that passage, Paul talks about some false apostles, and he treats them kind of like this. He assumes that they're gaslighting and they're toxic in all sorts of ways. Here's just some snippets of what he says in chapter 11. He says, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray by these people, he means, from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel, there's a word missing there, a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. What he's saying is, if somebody comes to you, and there's certain types of people, and you see that they're saying they're preaching Christianity, but this isn't the Jesus you recognize, This isn't the spirit you received when you were saved. This isn't the gospel you heard. Again, that word is missing, sorry, in the screen. You should recognize they're just there to deceive you. Do not believe them or follow them or bear it. Another place in the chapter, he says, I'm going to continue to speak against them, he says, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they're boasting. They want you to take them as seriously as you've been taking us. Such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it's not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. And then later in the passage, he says, you tolerate it. If anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. I have seen in the last few years that sometimes there are people who are abusive and toxic, and the people that they are mistreating keep going back and trying to dialogue again with them and relate again with them. And it would have been helpful in those cases for those people to have a little bit of the hermeneutic of suspicion as they dealt with these people. The third thing is it does help us be aware of systems. This is why it's so useful in critical race theory. There are ways in which systems just sort of tend to perpetuate themselves and keep themselves going even when it's not real. And systems involve things which are sort of hidden and invisible to us, and we don't notice them. We're affected by them without realizing it. So the world system in all its different forms and all the different systems around us, it's helpful to have a hermeneutic of suspicion with those things. But the hermeneutic of suspicion is like infrared goggles. If you put on infrared goggles, you can see the heat signature of people, and you'll see things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. It helps us see things we would not see otherwise. But there's a bunch of other things you don't see as well if you're looking through infrared goggles. It keeps us from seeing things we would see otherwise. So the hermeneutic of suspicion in certain key places can be helpful for us to think about things, but we shouldn't keep those goggles on all the time. We shouldn't always keep the hermeneutic of suspicion on. Matter of fact, I think we should rarely do it. Most of the time, we should use what one Christian philosopher has called a hermeneutic of trust instead. In the hermeneutic of trust, we assume that most people are rational. Most people are rational. Given the beliefs they have, they're actually making sense. Most people are well-meaning. They may very much disagree with us on what that means, but they're trying to live a good life and do good things. And that means we need to take people at their word. That doesn't mean we don't test what they say. It doesn't mean we don't recognize they could be wrong. But it means we listen and we acknowledge what they're saying. And unless they give us a reason not to believe them, we start by sort of assuming they're innocent until proven guilty. This is just a better way to dialogue. It's a better way to respond to people. The hermeneutic of trust. Use that when you dialogue with real people as opposed to memes. Most of the really frustrating stuff that happens in politics and in other areas is stuff that happens not between real people in person. It happens online. It happens in the internet. It happens somewhere where people are anonymous. They're trolling. They're making comments on a Facebook post or a Twitter or a tweet or something. And X, I guess now. But when you're dialoguing with real people face to face, it's amazing how everything changes. And the hermeneutic of trust is much more insightful, much more helpful, much more respectful. Use it especially when you want to understand people who disagree with you. What I've noticed is if you want to know how liberals really think about things, ask somebody who's liberal. Don't ask a conservative, because the conservatives get that wrong. And similarly, if you want to hear how conservatives really understand things, don't ask a liberal, ask a conservative, because the liberals really get that wrong. Each side drastically misunderstands what the other side is saying. The things you've heard about what the other side says are probably not true. Go talk to people on the other side and find out if they're true. And you'll be surprised sometimes. So when we listen to people who disagree with us, we need to listen with this kind of trust that understands that they're probably well-meaning, they're probably rational, they just probably have some big disagreements with us about some basic things. You use it to start with. Then if somebody proves themselves untrustworthy, you can switch to a hermeneutic of suspicion. But you presume people are innocent until proven guilty. And this, I think, is very helpful. So this is a place where I disagree to a large extent with critical race theory. I think it's too full of the hermeneutic of suspicion, but we Christians can do the same thing. Sometimes we tend to use the hermeneutic of suspicion too much. I think there's some place for using it, as I've sort of shown you through a couple of scriptures, but I think for the most part we need to live listening to and trusting what people are trying to say, listening to them sort of in good faith, and that will be much more helpful and much more fruitful, and it's much better way to show love to people. Okay, next week I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. I probably have said most of what I want to say about critical race theory. I might come back to American exceptionalism and some other things. I'm not sure yet. And then we're going to move on after that to talk about speech, sweetness of speech. And I'll see you then.